With the new book Sunrise on the Reaping coming out soon, I thought it was a good time to do some more Hunger Games videos. Annie Cresta, the wife of Finnick Odair, has one of the most tragic lives in the Hunger Games series. Even with a life full of loss, scars, and setbacks though, she still has a beautiful story. A story that I will cover in today's video. Just to be clear, this video is based on the novels and not the films. Some of the events between the two are very different, plus the movies left out most of Annie's arc. If you enjoy this video, please consider liking and sharing. It will greatly help in growing and sustaining the channel. And if you like what you see, hit that subscribe button, and you can also follow me on all of my other social medias, all of which are linked down below, and all of which house similar content that I make here on this channel. Now that I've said that, let's get into it. In the country of Panem, there are 12 districts. Of those 12 districts, there are 3 that are known as careers, and they produce the most well-trained tributes that enter the Hunger Games every year. Annie Cresta was born and raised in the 4th district, meaning she was surrounded by the excitement and buzz for the Hunger Games, which was just not the case for many of the other districts like District 12. The reason these career districts produce such elite fighters is because they train their whole lives for a chance to volunteer and honor their home and their people. District 4, where Annie grew up, is located in the western part of the country, which occupies what was formerly known as California. They took advantage of living on the coast, and their industry became fishing. This industry allowed them to become one of the wealthier of the 12 districts, and put them in favor with the capital, the rulers of Panem. Fish was a delicacy in the capital, so the capital citizens greatly liked District 4 and even funded them a bit more than the other districts. On top of that, with their industry being collecting food, they were much better fed and well nourished, perhaps second only to the citizens of the capital. Annie was a very pretty woman with long, flowing brown hair and sea green eyes. This differs from the movie where she had red hair and blue eyes. During Annie's early life, like most children in District 4, she learned the ways of their industry, allowing her to become adept at certain skills. The obvious one is fishing, but with that comes a few other talents. She learned to use weapons like spears and tridents, she was able to identify different kinds of marine life, and she also became skillful in tying knots, which helped her in creating nets, tying hooks and lines, and anchoring boats. But one of the most useful things she learned was becoming a powerful swimmer. Being on the coast, this was a part of her lifestyle, and this is a skill that will come in very handy later on in her story, which we'll get to later in the video. Annie adopted an accent that is particular to her district, and is something that is easily distinguishable to the rest of the country. I always like to think that this is sort of a surfer accent, being on the coast and obviously being in what used to be California. It's unknown if Annie was a part of the district's career training program, but based on context clues, I think it's likely that she was. For one, she was 18 when she was reaped, which is the age in which most careers opt to go into the arena because it's the max age you can be. And on top of that, if she hadn't volunteered, you would think that a career who had trained all their lives would have volunteered in her place. Again though, we don't know for sure, that's just speculation. The Hunger Games Annie was reaped for was the 70th Hunger Games, meaning it was 4 years before the original books took place. She was trained by former District 4 victors like Mags Flanagan, as well as Finnick Odair. Her relationship with Finnick was one that sort of came out of nowhere while they trained. Finnick was quoted saying, "She crept up on me." Once that spark did go off though, their relationship went past just student and teacher. Finnick had won the games 5 years previously in the 65th Hunger Games, and he was the youngest victor to ever do so, meaning that he and Annie were around the same age. It's likely that Finnick trained Annie harder than he had for any other student, desperate to ensure that she returned to him. Being part of a career district, Annie probably allied herself with the other career tributes from Districts 1 and 2. We know that she also formed good rapport with her fellow District 4 tribute. When it was time for the 70th Hunger Games to start and Annie entered the arena, things did not go well. Immediately, her fellow District 4 tribute, whom she had formed good rapport with, was not only killed, but beheaded right in front of Annie. This absolutely traumatized her and led to her breaking point. Any training she had was thrown out the window and forgotten, instead replaced with fear and anxiety. This trauma made her unable to fight, much less continue living in general. She went mad, and the only thing she could do was to isolate herself, hiding for the rest of the games. Isolating herself actually worked in her favor though. The game makers decided to throw a curveball with an earthquake, and this broke a dam. Most of the arena was flooded with water, and the only thing the remaining tributes could do was swim to the top and stay there to avoid drowning. This is where Annie, growing up in District 4, came to her advantage. She was by far the best swimmer due to her way of life back home, and she was able to keep herself afloat longer than any of the other tributes. When all of them drowned, Annie was declared the victor simply for outlasting everybody else. Annie was immediately treated following the games, and though everybody thought she would be alright and would go back to normal, she did not. Following her victory, the lasting effects of what she had seen and experienced in the arena stayed with her for years to come. Her diagnosis was that she suffered from mental instability and PTSD from the trauma her mind sustained. Noises would often set her off, whether it be bangs, clatters, or just simply another person's voice. When a noise triggered her, she would have to cover her ears with her hands to shut it out, and would sort of leave reality. Her social skills were also greatly affected, leading to her laughing at unusual and inappropriate times. On top of that, she sometimes fell into a daze staring at nothing, her eyes out of focus for long periods at a time. Those green eyes fixate on a point with such intensity that you find yourself trying to make out what she sees in the empty air. It's safe to say that her mind was incredibly messed up, and she would never be able to live the life she had before going into the arena. This deterioration of her mind probably became very clear to the rest of the country when she was forced to go on her victory tour 6 months after being crowned victor. As she went from district to district and eventually to the capital, the citizens of Panem would almost certainly notice a dramatic change in her, especially when compared to all of the interviews she had done leading up to the games. There was one good thing that came out of winning the games though, and that was Finnick Odair. Though many expected the handsome and very sought after Odair boy to disregard Annie because of her diagnosis, it was actually the complete opposite. He did not dismiss her, but instead loved her with all his heart. He helped her through her struggles, and was eventually the only person that was able to calm her down when her mind got away from her. They came up with a way of bringing her back, which was Finnick having her list what was real and what was not. Though previous winners of the Hunger Games had the responsibility of training upcoming tributes, Annie was unable to complete this task, and she stayed shut up in isolation when the time came for this. Finnick and Annie became lovers. However, they had to keep this a secret. During their relationship, Finnick was forced into sex trafficking by Coriolanus Snow, the president of Panem. He would offer Finnick up to capital citizens who were enticed by his confidence and good looks. Finnick knew that if the rest of the country found out he was spoken for with Annie, Snow would almost certainly go after her and possibly even kill her. It's unknown how Annie felt about Finnick spending nights with capital citizens, but just speculating, I imagine it was very hard on her, as it would be for anyone in that situation. Nevertheless, most of Finnick's time outside of the duties forced upon him were spent with Annie, growing their love even more. Finnick eventually joined the rebellion against the capital, but Annie herself did not join. In fact, desperate to keep her safe, Finnick did not tell Annie anything to do with the rebellion, which he saw as a way of keeping her safe and safe from being tortured if the capital ever wanted to get information out of her. Annie was unfortunately brought into the spotlight again when the third quarter quell arrived. 5 years after winning her games, she discovered that the 75th Hunger Games would reap from the existing pool of victors. Being on that stage was one of the first times she had ever appeared in public, and to her horror, she was chosen as the female victor to go back into the arena. Her mental instability was triggered as she broke down on the stage, but fellow victor Mags Flanagan, an older woman who had mentored both Annie and Finnick, volunteered in her place. While Annie thought that was the end of her suffering that day, things got much worse when Finnick was the male victor chosen, meaning she might lose the love of her life. Just as Finnick had feared, Snow used Annie against him. While in the arena, he made Jabberjay swoop down upon him as they repeated the torturous screams of Annie, which made Finnick believe that the birds had heard her being tortured. Finnick was eventually taken out of the arena by the rebellion and District 13, and the capital punished him by arresting Annie. They did not arrest her to get information out of her though, like they did for all of the other people that they captured. They did, however, keep her captive simply to get into Finnick's head. This worked as Finnick went through a mental breakdown, desperate to get Annie back. Some of the prisoners alongside Annie included Peta and Joanna. They were brutally tortured, and it's quite possible that Annie heard their screams. If so, this was probably the worst situation for Annie to be in, considering her already fragile mental state. And even if she didn't hear their screams, I'm sure there were many other horrible noises that would set her off, especially without Finnick there to calm her down. Luckily, she along with the other prisoners were all freed during a rescue mission committed by District 13 and the Rebellion, and she was reunited with Finnick. Their reunion made nobody doubt their love for one another, as Annie cried out Finnick's name in something between a shriek and a cry of joy. It was as if there was no one else in the world besides these two as they ran into each other's arms. When they collided, they lost their balance and slammed into a wall where they stayed for a long time, holding on tightly to each other and not letting go. Following their reunion, they did not hide their relationship anymore, and they decided to get married. The question was, what was Annie, the bride, going to wear? Katniss Everdeen ended up coming through as she took Annie to her home in District 12, where she had a variety of dresses made by her former stylist Cinna. Annie ended up choosing a silk green dress that brought out her beautiful green eyes. Annie and Finnick's wedding was beautiful. The decorations had an autumn theme, and the music was sung by a choir of children. 300 guests arrived to watch the ceremony, which had classic District 4 customs intertwined. During their vows, the two were covered in a woven net. When they kissed, they had salt water on their lips. And during the ceremony, they played an ancient District 4 wedding song that honored a sea voyage. Nothing could compete with the beauty of the couple though. The two glowed with love and admiration for each other. Who could look past the radiant face of two people for whom this day was once a virtual impossibility? Following their kiss, everybody toasted with their apple cider, and everybody danced in celebration. Peta Millark, a former baker, created a masterpiece of a cake. It was blue-green, had white-tipped icing waves, and at the top were fish, sailboats, seals, and sea flowers. Their wedding was also filmed for a propo, which Plutarch aired to the entire country to help build support for the rebellion, and this worked magnificently. Following their marriage, Annie and Finnick never let go of the other's hand. They were transformed and were happier than they had ever been in their lives. Annie still went into a daze from time to time, but when she did, she was lost in a daze of happiness rather than fear and anxiety. There were still moments when you could tell something slipped in her brain, but just a few words from Finnick would call her back almost right away. Later, she had an incident though. When Joanna talked aggressively about how she and Peta had heard each other's screams of torture while in District 13, this made Annie cover her ears as she exited reality. This also makes me think that she did in fact hear their screams of torture while in District 13, which I theorized earlier in the video. Following Joanna's words, Finnick got upset with her, and he comforted Annie by putting an arm around her. It took Finnick a moment to calm her down as he whispered things in her ear, but eventually she came back to reality. Deli Cartwright, a merchant who had escaped District 12, helped bring her back even more by telling her that Peta had designed her wedding cake. Unaware of this, Annie turned and thanked him, saying it was beautiful, and Peta told her it was his pleasure. As Finnick took Annie away from this scene, Peta made a comment saying that Finnick better be nice to her or he'd take Annie from him. Peta was still recovering from trauma of his own, but this comment just felt off. It could be a joke if the tone wasn't so cold. Everything it conveys is wrong. The open distrust of Finnick, the implication that Peta has his eye on Annie, that Annie could desert Finnick. Finnick replied to Peta in a joking, but also sort of a cold way, saying that Peta better not make him sorry that he restarted his heart during the third quarter quell. Finnick then led Annie away, and they went on a walk together to get Annie's mind right. At some point in District 13, Finnick and Annie conceived a child, and Annie became pregnant with their son. Tragically though, Finnick would never know this. This is because he was chosen to be part of a team that raided the capital, and under the recommendation of Katniss, he did not tell Annie he was going on this mission. He thought that not telling Annie would make her avoid unnecessary worry and pain. Annie eventually found out though when President Snow televised an explosion that he said killed Finnick and his entire squadron. This in fact did not kill them, but Finnick did end up losing his life later on in the mission. When Katniss saw into Finnick's eyes in the last seconds of his life, one of the things seen was Annie in her wedding dress. Annie was absolutely heartbroken, especially now when she was pregnant with his child. Following her husband's death, Annie took part in a meeting which discussed how to move forward following the capture of President Snow. Alma Quinn asked the surviving victors if they should continue the Hunger Games, but this time with the Capitol's children. Annie had of course been permanently scarred from the Hunger Games, not to mention terrified when Finnick went in. This gave Annie the chance to speak for both herself and her late husband, voting no, and adding that if Finnick was there, he would say the same thing. Unfortunately though, the majority overruled her. A pregnant Annie was present for President Snow's execution, and to hers and everybody else's shock, Katniss killed Coin instead. Annie then witnessed Snow, the man who had sex trafficked her husband, die shortly after that. This meant that it was done. The thing that Annie voted against would not come to fruition. The Hunger Games, the thing that had caused her so much pain, was finally gone. Annie moved back to her home in District 4, and there she gave birth to her and Finnick's son, and she became a mother. She sent Katniss a photo of him, which Katniss ended up putting in a memory book she had made. Annie went through very difficult struggles, but found a person who accepted her for who she was, no matter what was wrong with her. She was madly in love with Finnick, and though she experienced immense loss upon his death, she got to keep both hers and Finnick's legacy alive as she raised their son.